In the summer of 490 BCE, the Persian Empire, the most powerful force in the ancient world, launched what seemed like an inevitable conquest of Greece. The Persian army that landed on the shores of Marathon was battle-tested, numerically superior, and backed by the resources of an empire that stretched from India to Egypt. Yet, in one of history's most shocking military upsets, this seemingly invincible force was utterly defeated by a small Athenian army that should have been crushed beneath Persian boots. The Battle of Marathon became a defining moment not just for Greece, but for the entire course of Western civilization. But how did the Persians, with all their advantages, manage to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory? The answer lies not in Greek heroism alone, but in a series of critical mistakes made by the Persian commanders that turned what should have been a routine conquest into a catastrophic failure. These weren't minor tactical errors, but fundamental misunderstandings of Greek warfare, strategic blunders, and failures of leadership that doomed the Persian expedition before the first spear was thrown. The story of Marathon is often told as a tale of Greek courage triumphing over Persian tyranny, but the reality is far more complex. The Persian defeat was largely self-inflicted, the result of overconfidence, poor intelligence, and a series of decisions that played directly into Greek strengths while magnifying Persian weaknesses. By examining these mistakes, we can understand not just how Marathon was lost, but why this battle marked the beginning of the end for Persian ambitions in Europe. The strategic miscalculation. The first and perhaps most fundamental mistake made by the Persian Empire was in the very conception of their Greek campaign. King Darius I had dispatched his nephew Artaphernes and the general Datis, not just to punish Athens for supporting the Ionian revolt, but to complete the conquest of Greece as a natural extension of Persian dominion. This reflected a profound misunderstanding of what they were facing. The Persians had grown accustomed to fighting enemies who, once defeated in battle, would surrender their cities and submit to Persian rule. Their previous conquests had followed this pattern: defeat the army, capture the capital, install a friendly government, and move on. This approach had worked brilliantly across their vast empire, from the conquest of Lydia to the subjugation of Egypt. The Persian military machine was designed for this type of warfare, combining overwhelming numbers with diplomatic pressure to force quick surrenders. However, Greece was fundamentally different. The Greeks, particularly the Athenians, had developed a political system and cultural identity that made them far more likely to fight to the death rather than submit to foreign rule. The concept of eleutheria, freedom, was central to Greek political thought, and the idea of submitting to what they saw as barbarian despotism was anathema to their entire worldview. The Persians failed to grasp that they weren't just facing another army, but an entirely different civilization with radically different values. This strategic miscalculation led the Persians to approach the Greek campaign with the same tactics and expectations that had served them elsewhere. They assumed that a show of force, combined with the threat of overwhelming numbers, would be enough to secure Greek submission. They failed to prepare for the possibility of a prolonged campaign against an enemy willing to sacrifice everything rather than surrender their independence. Moreover, the Persians underestimated the military capabilities of the Greek city-states. Their intelligence about Greek warfare seems to have been remarkably poor, focusing on political divisions and internal conflicts rather than military strength. They knew that the Greeks were fractured and often fought among themselves, but they failed to understand that this constant warfare had produced some of the most effective heavy infantry in the ancient world. The Persian high command seems to have viewed the Greeks as barbarians on the periphery of civilization, not realizing that they were facing a military culture that had evolved specifically to counter the type of massed infantry and cavalry tactics that formed the backbone of Persian strategy. Perhaps no mistake was more costly to the Persian cause than their complete failure to understand Greek military capabilities and tactics. The Persian army was accustomed to facing enemies who fought in loose formations with relatively light equipment, relying on mobility and missile weapons. Their own tactical system had evolved to counter these threats, using a combination of archers, cavalry, and massed infantry to overwhelm and scatter enemy forces. The Greeks, however, had developed something entirely different: the phalanx. This formation of heavily armored spearmen fighting in tight ranks was specifically designed to counter the type of tactics the Persians employed. The phalanx was nearly invulnerable to arrow fire from the front, could absorb cavalry charges, and in close combat could generate tremendous striking power through coordinated spear thrusts. Most importantly, the phalanx was a mature military system that had been refined through decades of inter-Greek warfare. The Persians seem to have had little understanding of how the phalanx functioned or what it was capable of achieving. Their scouts and spies had apparently focused on political intelligence rather than military capabilities, leaving the Persian commanders unprepared for the shock of facing Greek heavy infantry in pitched battle. This intelligence failure extended beyond just understanding Greek tactics to include a fundamental misreading of Greek morale and fighting spirit. The Persian assessment of Greek capabilities was further distorted by their reliance on Greek exiles and political opponents of the current Athenian regime. These sources, while valuable for political intelligence, had strong incentives to downplay Athenian military strength and overemphasize internal divisions. The result was that Persian commanders arrived at Marathon with expectations based more on wishful thinking than accurate assessment of enemy capabilities. This intelligence failure also extended to understanding the terrain and its tactical implications. The plain of Marathon was chosen by the Persians as a landing site, partly because it offered good ground for their cavalry and room to deploy their superior numbers. However, they failed to appreciate how the terrain could be used by a tactically sophisticated enemy to neutralize these advantages. The Greeks would prove far more adept at using the local topography to their advantage than the Persians had anticipated. The tactical blunders at Marathon. When the Persian army finally faced the Greeks at Marathon, a series of tactical errors compounded their strategic and intelligence failures. The most critical mistake was the Persian decision to divide their forces in the face of the enemy. While exact details remain debated by historians, it appears that a significant portion of the Persian army, including much of their cavalry, was not present for the final battle. Some sources suggest they had been loaded back onto ships for a planned assault on Athens itself, while others indicate they may have been repositioned for other tactical purposes. This division of forces was catastrophic because it negated the Persians' primary advantage, their numerical superiority. The phalanx was most vulnerable when outnumbered and attacked from multiple directions, but with reduced numbers, the Persians could not effectively exploit this weakness. Instead of facing an overwhelming mass of enemies, the Greeks found themselves fighting a more manageable Persian force that they could meet on roughly equal terms. The Persian deployment on the day of battle compounded this error. Persian tactical doctrine called for placing their best troops, the elite immortals, and Persian heavy infantry in the center of their line, with allied and subject troops on the flanks. This formation had served them well in previous campaigns, where the elite center could break through enemy lines while the flanks held or pursued fleeing enemies. Against the Greek phalanx, however, this deployment played directly into enemy hands. The Athenian commander Miltiades had studied Persian tactics and understood their deployment patterns. He deliberately weakened his own center while strengthening his flanks with his best troops. When the battle began, the Persian center initially succeeded in pushing back the Greek center, exactly as their tactical doctrine predicted. However, the strong Greek flanks enveloped the advancing Persians, creating the classic double envelopment that would become known to military history as the pincer movement. The Persian commanders seem to have been completely unprepared for this tactical innovation. Their response to the developing envelopment was confused and ineffective, suggesting they had no contingency plans for dealing with such a maneuver. Instead of attempting an organized withdrawal or trying to break out of the developing trap, the Persian center continued to advance even as their flanks collapsed, walking deeper into the Greek trap. The cavalry problem. One of the most significant tactical mistakes made by the Persians was their failure to effectively employ their cavalry at Marathon. Persian military doctrine relied heavily on cavalry to harass enemy formations, exploit breakthroughs, and pursue fleeing enemies. The Persian cavalry was among the finest in the ancient world, combining excellent horsemanship with effective archery and shock tactics. Their absence or ineffective use at Marathon represented a massive squandering of military assets. Several factors contributed to this failure. First, the timing of the battle seems to have caught the Persians unprepared. Ancient sources suggest that the Greeks attacked early in the morning, possibly catching the Persian cavalry while they were watering their horses or otherwise unprepared for immediate combat. The Greek war cry, "The cavalry are away," mentioned in some accounts, suggests that Miltiades deliberately timed his attack for a moment when Persian cavalry was not in position to intervene effectively. Even if cavalry had been available, the Persian commanders failed to adapt their tactics to the reality of fighting the phalanx. Cavalry was most effective against loose formations of light infantry, where individual horsemen could ride down isolated soldiers or use their mobility to attack from unexpected directions. Against the tight formation of the phalanx, with its overlapping shields and projecting spears, cavalry charges were largely ineffective and potentially suicidal. The Persians should have used their cavalry for harassment and to prevent Greek tactical maneuvers rather than attempting direct charges. Mounted archers could have worn down the phalanx from a distance, forcing the Greeks to either endure casualties or break formation to pursue. Instead, the Persian cavalry seems to have been either absent from the battle entirely or committed to ineffective frontal attacks that played to Greek strengths. This failure to properly employ cavalry represented more than just a tactical error. It reflected a fundamental failure to adapt to the unique challenges posed by Greek warfare. The Persian military system was incredibly sophisticated and had proven effective across a wide range of enemies and terrain types. However, it required commanders who could think creatively and adapt their tactics to unexpected situations. At Marathon, the Persian leadership showed a rigid adherence to established doctrine, even when that doctrine was clearly inappropriate for the circumstances they faced. The leadership crisis. The Persian expedition to Greece suffered from a critical leadership problem that became apparent at Marathon. Unlike many Persian military campaigns, which were led by experienced generals with full authority to adapt their tactics and strategy as circumstances required, the Greek expedition seems to have suffered from divided command and unclear authority structures. This leadership crisis contributed significantly to the tactical and strategic errors that doomed the Persian army. Artaphernes and Datis were both experienced commanders, but their dual leadership created confusion about decision-making authority at crucial moments. Ancient sources suggest that there were disagreements between the two about how to proceed with the campaign, particularly regarding whether to attack Athens directly or to defeat the Athenian army first. This divided leadership meant that critical decisions were delayed or made without full consideration of their implications. More importantly, the Persian commanders seem to have been overconfident to the point of negligence. Their previous successes in expanding the Persian Empire had convinced them that Greek resistance would crumble quickly once faced with overwhelming Persian power. This overconfidence led to a series of tactical and strategic shortcuts that ultimately proved disastrous. Instead of conducting careful reconnaissance, developing contingency plans, or adapting their tactics to face Greek heavy infantry, they assumed that their standard approach would suffice. The Persian leadership also failed to maintain proper command and control during the battle itself. Ancient accounts suggest that once fighting began, Persian commanders lost effective control over their forces. This was partly due to the nature of ancient combat, where communication was difficult once battle was joined, but it also reflected poor preparation and planning. The Persians had no effective response to the Greek tactical maneuvers because their commanders had not anticipated such possibilities and had not prepared their subordinates to deal with unexpected situations. This leadership failure extended beyond just the immediate tactical situation to include a broader failure to understand the strategic implications of the campaign. The Persian commanders treated Marathon as just another conquest, failing to recognize that they were facing an enemy that required fundamentally different approaches. Their rigid adherence to established patterns of warfare and conquest prevented them from adapting to the unique challenges posed by Greek civilization and military culture. The psychological dimension. One of the most underappreciated aspects of the Persian defeat at Marathon was the psychological dimension of the conflict. The Persians had built their military success partly on their reputation for invincibility, using the threat of overwhelming force to secure surrenders without fighting. However, this psychological advantage worked against them when facing an enemy that was not intimidated by their reputation and was prepared to fight to the death. The Greek forces at Marathon were fighting for their homeland, their families, and their way of life. This gave them a level of motivation that the Persian army, composed largely of conscripts and subject peoples fighting for a distant emperor, could not match. The psychological advantage that had served the Persians so well in other campaigns became a liability when facing an enemy with superior motivation and nothing to lose. Moreover, the Persian reliance on psychological warfare through displays of overwhelming numbers backfired at Marathon. The sight of the massive Persian fleet and army may have intimidated some Greeks, but it also served to convince the Athenians that they were facing an existential threat that required total commitment. Instead of inspiring surrender, the Persian show of force galvanized Greek resistance and convinced wavering allies that the stakes were high enough to justify extreme measures. The Persian commanders also seem to have underestimated the psychological impact of fighting an enemy on their home ground. The Greeks knew the terrain intimately and could use local knowledge to their advantage in ways that the Persians had not anticipated. More importantly, the Greeks were fighting with the knowledge that defeat meant not just military loss, but the destruction of their entire way of life. This created a level of desperation and determination that Persian forces, accustomed to fighting enemies who could survive defeat through submission, were not prepared to encounter. The psychological dimension of the conflict also affected Persian decision-making during the campaign. Overconfidence led to poor preparation and inadequate intelligence gathering, while the expectation of easy victory made Persian commanders less likely to adapt their tactics when initial approaches proved unsuccessful. By the time the reality of Greek resistance became apparent, the Persians had already committed themselves to a course of action that played to their enemy's strengths. The aftermath and long-term consequences. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Marathon revealed additional Persian mistakes that compounded their defeat. Instead of regrouping and learning from their tactical failures, the Persian response to defeat showed a continued misunderstanding of what they were facing in Greece. The decision to continue with an attack on Athens by sea, even after the land army had been defeated, demonstrated that Persian commanders still failed to grasp the nature of Greek resistance. This follow-up attack was easily thwarted by the rapid march of the victorious Athenian army back to Athens, arriving in time to defend their city against the Persian fleet. The sight of the same Greek soldiers who had just defeated them at Marathon waiting on the beaches of Athens finally convinced the Persians to withdraw. But the damage to Persian prestige and strategic position was already done. The Persian defeat at Marathon had consequences far beyond the immediate tactical reverse. For the first time, the Persian Empire had been decisively defeated by a numerically inferior enemy, proving that Persian forces were not invincible. This had immediate effects throughout the Greek world, encouraging other city-states to resist Persian expansion and creating the conditions for the larger conflicts that would follow. More importantly, the Persian mistakes at Marathon revealed fundamental weaknesses in their military system when faced with sophisticated enemies fighting for survival. The rigid adherence to established tactical patterns, the failure to adapt to new types of warfare, and the over-reliance on psychological intimidation rather than tactical superiority all became apparent weaknesses that Greek commanders would exploit in future conflicts. The long-term strategic consequences of the Persian defeat extended far beyond Greece itself. The failure to conquer Greece left a dangerous enemy on the western frontier of the Persian Empire, one that would eventually launch its own campaigns of conquest under Alexander the Great. The mistakes that doomed the Persian army at Marathon thus had consequences that would ultimately contribute to the downfall of the Persian Empire itself. Conclusion: the Persian defeat at Marathon was not the result of Greek superiority alone, but rather the consequence of a series of critical mistakes that transformed what should have been a routine conquest into a catastrophic failure. The most fundamental error was the Persian failure to understand that they were facing an entirely different type of enemy with radically different motivations and military capabilities. From the strategic miscalculation that misunderstood Greek resistance to the tactical blunders that negated Persian advantages, each mistake compounded the others. The intelligence failures, leadership problems, and overconfidence all contributed to a disaster that could have been avoided. The Persians had superior numbers and resources, but their rigid adherence to established patterns prevented them from adapting to the unique challenges of Greek warfare. The Battle of Marathon stands as a powerful reminder that even the most sophisticated military systems can fail when leaders make fundamental errors in understanding their enemy. The Persian army defeated itself as much as it was defeated by Greek arms, turning what should have been the first step in European conquest into one of history's most decisive reversals. That's our deep dive into the mistakes that doomed the Persian army at Marathon. What do you think was the most critical error made by the Persian commanders? Did their overconfidence doom them from the start, or could better tactical decisions have changed the outcome? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this analysis of ancient military disasters, make sure to subscribe to HR History for more in-depth explorations of history's most pivotal battles and the decisions that shaped them. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest historical investigations, and check out our other videos on ancient warfare and military strategy. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode where we'll be exploring another fascinating chapter in military history.